They looked at me, smiled politely, and told me I was too small to be taken seriously. So I stayed quiet, built everything in the shadows, and waited until the day I walked back into their office. Not as a girl they rejected, but as the woman who owned it all. Disclaimer: this is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, companies, or events is purely coincidental and unintentional. The room felt colder than it should have been, even though the air conditioning wasn't that strong. Maybe it was the silence. Or maybe it was the way everyone sat so still, watching me like I had already failed before I even began. I adjusted the file in my hands and took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. This was the moment I had been preparing for weeks, no, months. Every slide, every number, every sentence had been practiced again and again until I could say it without looking. I knew my idea worked. I believed in it. That was supposed to be enough. There were 6 people sitting across the long glass table. Expensive suits, calm faces, and expressions that were hard to read. The man in the center, the CEO, leaned slightly back in his chair. His fingers loosely joined together, as if he had all the time in the world. No one smiled. No one nodded. They simply waited. I began my presentation. At first, my voice felt tight, but as I moved forward, it grew stronger. I explained the problem, then the solution I had created. I showed them the numbers, the market research, the early results I had managed to achieve on my own. I spoke about growth, about scalability, about how this idea could change the way their company operated. Every word was clear in my mind. I didn't rush. I didn't stumble. This was everything I had. But something felt off. They weren't reacting. No questions. No curiosity. No interruptions. Just quiet faces staring back at me. It wasn't the kind of silence that shows interest. It was the kind that makes you feel invisible. I pushed forward anyway, refusing to let that silence shake me. I reached the final slide and paused, letting my last point settle in the room. For a moment, there was nothing. I stood there, waiting, holding on to a small piece of hope that someone would speak, that someone would at least ask a question. My heart was beating faster now, each second stretching longer than the last. Finally, the CEO shifted slightly. He leaned forward just enough to rest his arms on the table. His expression didn't change much, but there was a small smile on his face. Not warm, not encouraging, just polite. "Your idea is interesting," he said. The word should have felt like a relief, but something in his tone made my chest tighten instead. He paused, glancing briefly at the others before looking back at me. "But you're too small for us." That was it. No discussion. No deeper analysis. No questions about the data I had spent so much time preparing. Just a simple sentence that dismissed everything I had brought into that room. I blinked, trying to process what he had just said. Too small. The words echoed in my mind, louder than they should have been. I wanted to respond, to explain, to tell them they were wrong, but the moment didn't give me space. One of the others nodded slightly, as if the decision had already been made long before I walked in. Another person closed her file. The meeting was over. I felt my fingers tighten around my papers as I slowly gathered them. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. The room that had once felt so important now felt empty, like it had nothing left for me. As I turned to leave, I noticed my reflection faintly in the glass wall. For a second, I barely recognized myself. I looked smaller than I felt inside, like their words had already started to change how I saw myself. I walked out of the room, each step steady, even though my thoughts were anything but. The door closed softly behind me, but the sound felt final, like something had ended. The hallway outside was brighter, but it didn't feel any warmer. People moved around, busy with their own work, unaware of what had just happened. To them it was just another day, another meeting, another person coming and going. But for me, it was something else entirely. I had walked in with hope. I walked out with something heavier. It wasn't just rejection. It wasn't even the loss of an opportunity. It was the way they had looked at me, the way they had decided my limits without truly understanding what I was capable of. They hadn't rejected my idea. They had rejected me. I stopped near the exit, holding my file close for a moment. Part of me wanted to go back, to knock on that door and demand another chance, to make them listen. But another part of me stayed still, quiet, observing, learning. Because deep down, beneath the disappointment and the anger, something else was beginning to form. Something sharper. Something more focused. They thought I was small. And maybe, in that moment, I was, but that didn't mean I would stay that way. That night the city felt unusually quiet, even though nothing had really changed outside. Cars still passed. Lights still flickered in distant buildings, and people still moved through their routines without noticing anything different. But inside my small apartment, everything felt heavier. I placed my file on the table and stood there for a moment, staring at it like it carried the weight of the entire day. The same file that once felt like possibility now felt like proof of rejection. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call anyone. My phone buzzed a few times with messages, but I ignored them. I already knew what people would say if I told them what happened. They would try to comfort me, tell me it wasn't a big deal, that something better would come. But I didn't want comfort. I didn't want easy words. I wanted to understand what had really happened in that room. I pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, opening the file again. The pages looked exactly the same, clean, organized, carefully prepared. The idea hadn't suddenly become weaker. The numbers hadn't changed. Everything I had presented was still valid. Yet somehow, it hadn't been enough. Or maybe, I realized, it had never been about the idea at all. Their words replayed in my mind, especially his voice, calm and certain. "You're too small for us." It wasn't said with anger or disrespect. That's what made it worse. It was said like a fact, like something obvious, something that didn't need further explanation. In that moment, I understood that they hadn't rejected my work. They had measured my value based on where I stood, not where I could go. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. For a brief second, doubt tried to settle in. What if they were right? What if I really was too small? Too inexperienced, too unknown, too insignificant to make a difference at that level? The thought was uncomfortable, but it was honest. I didn't push it away immediately. I let it sit there, letting it test me. But the more I thought about it, the more something inside me resisted. If being small meant I didn't have a large company, a powerful network, or a long list of achievements, then yes, maybe I was small. But that didn't mean I lacked ability. It didn't mean I couldn't build something greater. It just meant I hadn't done it yet. That realization shifted something. I sat up again, this time with more focus. The rejection was real, but it didn't have to define the outcome. It could become a starting point instead. Not a moment to retreat, but a moment to rethink everything. I closed the file gently and pushed it aside, no longer seeing it as an ending. I reached for my laptop and opened it. The screen lit up the room, casting a soft glow on the walls. I didn't open social media. I didn't search for distractions. Instead, I opened a blank document. For a few seconds, I just looked at the empty page. Then I started typing. Not a complaint, not a message to anyone, just a simple plan. If they thought I was too small, then I needed to understand exactly what that meant. Was it resources, experience, visibility, influence? I began breaking it down piece by piece, turning their vague judgment into something measurable. The more I analyzed it, the clearer it became. Small wasn't a permanent label. It was a temporary position. And positions can change. I wrote down what I needed to build, skills I had to improve, connections I needed to make, opportunities I had to create instead of waiting for. It wasn't going to be quick. It wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time since leaving that room, I felt a sense of control returning. Hours passed without me noticing. The silence of the night no longer felt heavy. It felt useful. Every thought became sharper, more structured. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was planning. At some point I paused and looked at what I had written. It wasn't perfect, but it was clear, it was mine. And most importantly, it didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I closed my laptop slowly and sat there for a moment, letting everything settle. The anger I'd felt earlier hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer loud or overwhelming. It had become something quieter, something more controlled, something more powerful. I stood up and walked to the window. The city lights stretched out in front of me, each one representing someone else's story, someone else's struggle, someone else building something in their own way. I wasn't alone in this. I was just at a different stage. My reflection in the glass looked the same as it had earlier, but I didn't feel the same. The rejection was still there, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a line I had crossed, a point I could look back on later. I didn't need to prove them wrong immediately. I didn't need to go back and argue or explain. That wasn't the kind of response that would change anything. What would change everything was growth. Real, undeniable growth. I turned away from the window and picked up my phone, finally unlocking it. There were still unread messages waiting, but I didn't open them. They could wait. This moment was mine. I placed the phone back down and looked around my small apartment. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't powerful. But it was where everything would begin. And without saying a word to anyone, without announcing anything to the world, I made a decision that would shape everything that came next. I would come back one day, but not to ask for a chance. The next few weeks didn't feel dramatic or inspiring. There were no big breakthroughs, no sudden success, no moment where everything changed overnight. Instead, it was quiet, repetitive, and often exhausting. I started taking on small freelance projects, work that most people would ignore or consider too minor to matter. The pay wasn't impressive, and the clients weren't well known, but I accepted everything that aligned with my skills. At that stage, I wasn't chasing recognition. I was building momentum. My days became structured in a way they had never been before. I woke up early, not because I had to, but because I couldn't afford to waste time. Every hour mattered. I would spend the morning working on client tasks, making sure every detail was precise, every delivery better than expected. Even though these clients didn't know my long-term vision, I treated each project as if it were part of something bigger. Because to me, it was. In the afternoons, I shifted my focus. This was when I worked on my own idea, the one that had been rejected. I didn't abandon it. Instead, I refined it. I tested different approaches, adjusted features, improved the structure. Without the pressure of a boardroom watching me, I had the freedom to experiment. Sometimes things worked, sometimes they didn't. But every failure taught me something useful. Nights were the hardest. That was when the fatigue set in. My eyes would burn from staring at screens all day, and my body would beg for rest. But I had made a promise to myself, and I wasn't ready to break it. So I kept going. I read articles, watched tutorials, studied case studies of businesses that had grown from nothing. I wasn't just working, I was learning constantly, filling every gap in my knowledge. Money was tight at first. I tracked every expense carefully, cutting out anything unnecessary. There were moments when I questioned whether it was worth it, whether I should take a safer path, something more stable. But every time that thought appeared, I remembered that room, that sentence, that quiet dismissal. It pushed me forward. After a few months, things began to shift, slowly but noticeably. My freelance work improved, not just in quality, but in value. Clients started coming back with more projects. Some even referred me to others. What had started as small tasks turned into steady income. It still wasn't huge, but it was consistent. That consistency gave me room to think bigger. I reached out to a few people I trusted, individuals who were skilled, reliable, and equally hungry to grow. I didn't promise them success or big rewards. I simply shared my vision honestly. Some declined, unsure of the uncertainty. But a few said yes. That's how the team began. It wasn't a formal company at first. No fancy office, no titles, no complex structure. Just a small group of people working together, connected by a shared goal. We communicated online, shared tasks, and supported each other through the challenges. Everyone brought something valuable, and together, we became stronger than we were individually. We focused on building our product quietly. No loud announcements, no marketing campaigns designed to attract attention. We knew we weren't ready for that yet. Instead, we focused on making something that worked, something that solved real problems. The first version wasn't perfect. It had flaws, limitations, and areas that needed improvement. But it was real. It existed beyond ideas and presentations. And that alone felt like progress. We tested it with a few users, carefully observing their feedback. Some loved certain features. Others pointed out issues we hadn't considered. We listened to everything. Every comment became a guide for the next improvement. Step by step, the product became better. Time passed faster than I expected. What felt like endless days of work began to turn into measurable growth. Our user base, though small at first, started expanding. People began recommending our service to others. Not because of marketing, but because it actually helped them. That was the turning point. For the first time, I realized we were no longer just building, we were growing. We started getting clients from outside our immediate circle, even from different countries. It was unexpected at first. Seeing messages from people in places I had never been felt almost unreal. They didn't know my story. They didn't know I had been rejected. They only knew the value we provided. And that was enough. With growth came new challenges. Managing multiple clients, improving the product, and coordinating the team required more structure. I had to step into a leadership role, making decisions that affected everyone. It wasn't always easy. There were disagreements, delays, and moments of uncertainty, but each challenge forced me to improve, not just as a professional, but as a leader. We still worked quietly. No one outside our circle really noticed what was happening, and that was intentional. We didn't need attention, we needed progress. Every now and then, I would think back to that day in the boardroom. The memory didn't hurt the same way anymore. It had become something else, a reference point. A reminder of where I started. They had seen me as small, and in a way, they were right at that time. But what they didn't see was what I was becoming during these long days, and even longer nights, in the moments when no one was watching, in the work that no one applauded, because this was where everything was changing, piece by piece, quietly building into something far greater than they had ever imagined. It happened on a normal afternoon. The kind that didn't feel important at first. I was sitting at my desk, going through routine updates, checking client messages, and reviewing progress with the team. Everything was moving steadily. Nothing unusual, nothing urgent. Then, almost by accident, I came across a headline while scrolling through business news. The company name caught my attention immediately. It was the same company, the one that had rejected me. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, unsure of what I expected to see. Maybe success, maybe growth, maybe confirmation that they were doing exactly what they believed they were capable of. But the headline said something different. It talked about losses, about a failed product launch, about investors becoming uncertain. I leaned forward slightly, reading every word more carefully. The article explained that their latest project, the one they had invested heavily in, had not performed as expected. The market response was weak. Customers were not satisfied. Competitors were gaining ground. It wasn't just a small issue. It was something deeper, something that was beginning to affect their position in the industry. I clicked on another article, then another, moving from one source to the next. The story remained consistent. Their numbers were dropping. Their strategies were being questioned. Analysts were starting to express doubt. For a company that once appeared so confident, so stable, This shift felt significant. I sat back in my chair, letting the information settle. A part of me felt surprised. Another part felt curious. But what I didn't feel was satisfaction. This wasn't about seeing them fail. It wasn't that simple. Instead, something else began to form: a sense of awareness, a recognition of possibility. I opened a new tab and started searching more deliberately. Financial reports, performance summaries, investor briefings, anything I could access. I wasn't just reading headlines anymore. I was studying patterns. I wanted to understand what had gone wrong, not from an emotional perspective, but from a strategic one. Their product had failed, but failure rarely comes from one mistake. It usually comes from a series of decisions that don't align with reality. I looked at their approach, their timing, their positioning in the market. Slowly, a clearer picture began to appear. They had moved too quickly in one direction, ignoring certain risks. They had relied on assumptions that didn't hold up under real conditions. I noticed something else as well. Their structure, once a strength, had started to become a weakness. Large systems, multiple layers of decision-making, slow adaptation. The very size that made them powerful was now making them less flexible. And in a changing market, flexibility mattered. I leaned forward again, this time with more focus. This wasn't just information anymore. It was insight. I pulled out a notebook and began writing down key points. Weaknesses, gaps, missed opportunities. I compared their situation with what I had been building, not to judge, but to evaluate. Where were they struggling? Where were we stronger? Where were we stronger? Where did our approach differ? The more I analyzed, the more I realized something important. The gap between us wasn't as large as it once seemed. Yes, they still had more resources, more visibility, more influence. But they also had problems that couldn't be solved easily. And for the first time, I saw a path. It wasn't a clear, straight path. It wasn't simple or guaranteed. But it was there. A possibility that hadn't existed before. A shift in position that changed the entire dynamic. I closed my eyes for a moment, thinking through the implications. If they continued on this path, their value would decrease. Their stability would weaken. And eventually, they would have to make decisions, big ones, decisions that could open doors. I stood up and walked slowly across the room, my thoughts moving faster than my steps. This wasn't something to rush into. It wasn't a moment for reaction. It required patience, precision, and complete understanding. Because opportunity without preparation is just another form of risk. I went back to my desk and opened my laptop again, this time with a different mindset. I wasn't just building my own company anymore. I was observing another one, studying its behavior, predicting its next moves. Days turned into a routine of quiet research. I followed their updates closely, tracking every change, every announcement, every signal they sent to the market. Some days there was nothing new. Other days, small details revealed more than they intended. I didn't share this with my team immediately. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I needed clarity first. This was bigger than a single decision. It was a long-term move that required careful planning. At times, I questioned whether I was reading too much into it. Whether this was just a temporary setback for them, something they would recover from quickly. But each new piece of information pointed in the same direction. The pattern was consistent. They were vulnerable. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible. Because recognizing weakness in another system comes with a choice: ignore it or act on it. I looked at the notes I had written, the connections I had made, the possibilities that were beginning to take shape. This wasn't about revenge in the way people usually think of it. There was no anger driving my decisions now, only clarity. They had once seen me as too small to matter. Now, for the first time, I was looking at them not as something out of reach, but as something that could be understood, analyzed, and maybe, one day, approached from a completely different position, because what I was seeing wasn't just a company struggling. It was the first real opening in a system that once felt impossible to touch. Once I understood the pattern of their decline, I knew this wasn't something to approach emotionally or impulsively. It had to be calculated. Every move needed to be precise, almost invisible. This wasn't about making a statement or proving anything publicly. It was about positioning, timing, and control. So instead of making bold decisions, I started with the smallest possible step. I began learning everything I could about how ownership in large companies actually worked. Not just the basic idea of shares, but the deeper structure: how influence grows, how voting power shifts, how control can change hands without noise. I spent hours studying market behavior, acquisition strategies, and case studies of silent takeovers. It was a different kind of learning compared to building my own product. This required patience and discipline on a completely different level. When I made my first purchase, it was almost insignificant. A small number of shares, barely enough to be noticed. It didn't change anything. It didn't give me power. But it gave me a starting point. It made the situation real. I wasn't just observing anymore. I was participating. I didn't rush to buy more immediately. Instead, I watched. I tracked the price movements, the reactions to news, the behavior of other investors. The market wasn't just numbers. It was emotion, fear, confidence, uncertainty. Understanding those patterns became essential. Over time, I increased my position slowly. Not in large, obvious jumps, but in small, consistent steps. Each purchase was planned, timed carefully to blend into normal activity. There were days when I did nothing, choosing to wait rather than act without purpose. Patience became my biggest advantage. I also knew that doing this alone would limit how far I could go. So I began connecting with a few individuals who had experience in finance and investments. Not many, just a small circle. People who understood discretion, who valued strategy over attention. I didn't tell them everything at once. Trust was built gradually, through conversations, shared ideas, and mutual respect. Some of them became quiet partners. They didn't need recognition or public involvement. They understood the long game. Together, we created a structure that allowed us to increase our influence without drawing attention. Different channels, different accounts, different approaches, all aligned toward the same goal. What mattered most was staying unnoticed. The company was already dealing with its own problems. Their focus was inward, trying to stabilize their position, manage investor concerns, and respond to market pressure. The last time I expected was someone quietly building a position from the outside, piece by piece. There were moments when the process felt slow, almost frustrating. Weeks would pass with minimal progress. The numbers would move slightly, then settle again. It would have been easy to lose patience, to try and speed things up. But I reminded myself that this wasn't a race. Moving too fast would attract attention, and attention would ruin everything. So I stayed disciplined. At the same time, I continued running my own business. That part of my life didn't stop. If anything, it became even more important. The stronger my company became, the more stable my position was. Growth on one side supported strategy on the other. They weren't separate paths, they were connected. Balancing both wasn't easy. There were days when decisions overlapped, when time felt limited, when pressure built from different directions. But those challenges forced me to become sharper, more focused. I learned to prioritize, to delegate, to trust my team more than before. Months passed, and slowly, the numbers began to change in a way that mattered. My position, combined with my partners, was no longer insignificant. It still wasn't dominant, but it was meaningful. Enough to be considered, enough to matter in certain situations. And still, no one noticed. That was the most important part. From the outside, everything looked normal. The company continued its operations, investors continued their routines, and the market behaved as expected. There was no sudden shift, no visible disruption. But beneath that surface, something was changing. Every small step I had taken was adding up. Every decision, every delay, every calculated move was building toward something larger. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't visible, but it was real. Occasionally, I would think back to that meeting room, to the moment I was dismissed without a second thought. It didn't feel painful anymore. It felt distant, almost like a different version of my life. The emotions had faded, replaced by clarity and purpose. This wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about building something that spoke for itself, something that didn't need validation. And now, for the first time, I wasn't just building my own path. I was quietly stepping into theirs. One decision at a time, without making a sound, without asking for permission, and without giving them any reason to look in my direction until it was already too late. The invitation came through an email that looked ordinary at first. A business conference, a gathering of industry leaders, investors, and entrepreneurs. I had received similar invitations before, but this one felt different for reasons I couldn't immediately explain. Maybe it was the list of attendees, or maybe it was the timing. Either way, I accepted without overthinking it. On the day of the event, everything felt polished and controlled. The venue was large, filled with soft lighting, quiet conversations, and the steady movement of people who all seemed to know exactly why they were there. I walked in calmly, dressed simply but professionally, blending into the environment without drawing attention. That had become natural to me over time, observing more than speaking, listening more than reacting. I spent the first part of the event moving through different sections, listening to panel discussions, engaging in brief conversations, and taking mental notes. There was a rhythm to these spaces. People spoke confidently, often repeating familiar ideas, presenting themselves in a way that felt practiced. I didn't judge it, I understood it. This was how influence worked in public spaces. Then I saw him. He was standing near one of the central areas, speaking to a small group of people. The same posture, the same calm confidence, the same controlled tone I remembered from that meeting room. The CEO. The man who had dismissed me so easily. For a moment, everything around me seemed to slow down, not because of emotion, but because of awareness. I didn't approach him immediately. Instead, I observed. The way he interacted, the way others responded to him, the subtle shifts in conversation when he spoke. There was still authority in his presence, but something had changed. It was small, almost unnoticeable to anyone who didn't look closely, but it was there. A slight tension, a hint of pressure beneath the surface, the kind that comes from dealing with challenges that aren't fully resolved. After a while, our paths crossed naturally. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden confrontation. Just a simple introduction, like any other professional interaction. He looked at me with polite interest, the way people do when they are meeting someone new. He didn't recognize me. That realization didn't surprise me. Back then, I had been just another face, another presentation, another short meeting in his schedule. There was no reason for me to stand out in his memory. And now, standing in front of him again, I didn't remind him. We spoke briefly. He asked the usual questions, what I did, what I was working on, how things were going. I answered calmly, keeping my responses clear but limited. I didn't mention the past. I didn't refer to the meeting. There was no need. This conversation existed in the present, and that was where I stayed. At one point, he began talking about his company, about resilience, about how businesses face challenges and adapt. His tone was steady, his words carefully chosen. To anyone else, it would have sounded confident, even inspiring. But as I listened, I could hear the underlying reality behind those words. I had studied his company long enough to understand what wasn't being said. He spoke about growth, but I knew about the decline. He spoke about strength, but I had seen the weaknesses. Still, I didn't react. I nodded, listened, and maintained a neutral expression. This wasn't a moment for judgment or correction. It was a moment for understanding, because in that conversation, something became very clear to me. He had no idea who I was now. Not just in terms of recognition, but in terms of position. He didn't know what I had built, what I had learned, or what I had quietly become part of. To him, I was just another professional in the room. Someone with potential, perhaps, but nothing more. That lack of awareness was more valuable than anything else. It meant I was still invisible in the way that mattered most. The conversation ended naturally. We exchanged polite acknowledgments, and he moved on to speak with someone else. There was no tension, no confrontation, no indication that anything unusual had happened. But for me, that moment carried weight. I stepped away and found a quieter corner of the venue, allowing myself a few seconds to process what had just occurred. Not emotionally, but strategically. Seeing him in person, hearing him speak, observing his behavior, it added another layer to everything I already knew. Information that couldn't be found in reports or articles. Information that only comes from direct observation. I realized that the gap between us had shifted even more than I thought, not just in terms of position, but in terms of awareness. I understood his situation, his company, his challenges. He understood nothing about mine. That imbalance created an advantage. The rest of the event continued as expected. Conversations, presentations, networking. I participated where necessary, but my focus had already moved beyond the surface. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to confirm what I'd been building toward. And now, I had. As I left the venue later that day, the air outside felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because my perspective had become sharper. The pieces were coming together more clearly now. The company was still struggling. My position was still growing. And the person who once had the power to decide my value had just stood in front of me, unaware that the balance had already begun to shift, because while he continued to speak about control and leadership, he had no idea that someone he once overlooked was now quietly moving into a position where those words would soon mean something very different for both of us. The announcement didn't come as a shock, but it still carried weight when it finally happened. It appeared first in a formal statement, then quickly spread across business news platforms. The company was officially exploring buyout options. They framed it carefully, using words like strategic transition and long-term stability, but the meaning was clear to anyone who understood the situation. They needed help, and they needed it soon. I read the statement more than once, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to catch every detail, every subtle signal hidden between the lines. The timing matched everything I had been observing. Their financial pressure had reached a point where internal solutions were no longer enough. External intervention was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. This was the moment everything had been leading toward, but instead of reacting immediately, I stayed still. The market, on the other hand, didn't. Within hours, speculation began. Analysts discussed possible buyers, investors evaluated risks, and larger companies started showing interest. Names began circulating, powerful groups with the resources to take full control. Their approach was predictable. They would step in with strong offers, demand authority, and reshape the company according to their own priorities. From a distance, it looked like the outcome was already decided. But I knew something they didn't. I wasn't entering this moment as an outsider. Over the past months, my position had grown quietly, supported by careful planning and disciplined execution. The shares I held, combined with those of my partners, formed a foundation that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't dominant, but it was significant enough to influence direction. That difference changed everything. I called a meeting with the small group of partners I trusted. We didn't rush into conclusions. Instead, we broke the situation down step by step. What were the company's immediate needs? What were other investors likely to demand? Where did our strengths align with their weaknesses? The discussion was focused, precise, and grounded in reality. There was no excitement, no emotional reaction. Everyone understood the importance of this moment. A single mistake could undo everything we had built. We agreed on one thing immediately: we would not compete through noise. The larger investors would make bold moves, public statements, aggressive offers designed to take control quickly. That wasn't our strategy. We didn't need to overpower them. We needed to outmaneuver them. Our advantage was subtle but powerful. We already had a position inside the system. We understood the company's structure, its vulnerabilities, and its potential. More importantly, we didn't need complete control to create value. We needed the right kind of control. That meant our offer had to be different, not louder, not bigger, smarter. Over the next few days, We worked quietly, building a proposal that aligned with what the company truly needed, not just what it appeared to want. We focused on stability, continuity, and gradual improvement rather than immediate restructuring. Where others might demand sweeping changes, we offered calculated adjustments. Where others might replace leadership entirely, we proposed strategic shifts. It wasn't about taking over quickly, it was about becoming the most reasonable choice. At the same time, I continued monitoring the market response. The bigger investors were doing exactly what we expected, announcing interest, positioning themselves as saviors, presenting large-scale plans. On the surface, their offers looked impressive, but they came with conditions, with expectations of control that could disrupt the company even further. That created hesitation, and hesitation created space. We submitted our offer quietly. No press release, no public attention, no attempt to compete for headlines. It was delivered directly, structured carefully, supported by data and a clear vision for the future. Everything about it was designed to communicate one thing: understanding. We weren't just offering money. We were offering direction. Then came the waiting. This was the most difficult part. Not because there was nothing to do, but because control shifted temporarily. The decision was no longer in our hands alone. The company had to evaluate its options, weigh the risks, and choose a path forward. Days passed with little information. Speculation continued outside, but inside, everything remained quiet. I maintained my routine, focusing on my business, staying engaged with my team. But part of my mind was always connected to that process. Every update, no matter how small, mattered. At times, doubt tried to return. Not the same kind I had felt before, but a more calculated version. Had we positioned ourselves correctly? Had we underestimated the competition? Were we moving too carefully, or not carefully enough? But each time those questions appeared, I went back to the foundation we had built. Every step had been deliberate. Every move had been based on understanding, not assumption. We weren't guessing. We were executing. Then, gradually, the signals began to change. The tone of discussion shifted. The company's communication became more focused, less open to broad speculation. Certain investors who had been very visible at the beginning became quieter. It wasn't obvious to most people, but to someone watching closely it was clear. The decision was moving closer. And for the first time, I felt something different. Not excitement, not anxiety, but clarity. A sense that the path I had been building was no longer just a possibility. It was becoming reality. I thought back to where this had started. A simple rejection, a single sentence that had defined how they saw me. At that time, I had no leverage, no position, no influence. Now I was part of a process that would decide the future of that same company. Not by chance, not by luck, but by design. And as the final stages approached, one thing became certain. This wasn't just about entering their world anymore. It was about reshaping it in a way they would never have expected, led by someone they once believed was too small to matter. The boardroom felt different this time, even before I stepped inside. The air was heavier, not with tension alone, but with anticipation that had no clear direction. People moved more slowly, spoke more carefully, and glanced at each other as if every word now carried consequences. This was not a routine meeting. Everyone in that building knew it, even if no one said it out loud. When I entered, there was no dramatic reaction, no gasps, no sudden recognition, just a subtle shift in energy. The kind that happens when a room senses something unfamiliar, but cannot immediately place it. I walked in calmly, holding my documents, maintaining the same composed expression I had learned to keep through months of pressure and planning. The seating arrangement had changed since the last time I had been in a similar environment. Now I was placed closer to the center, not at the edges where observers usually sit. That detail alone spoke volumes. Position in a room like this is never accidental. It reflects influence, even before a single word is spoken. Across the table, I saw familiar faces. Some were executives, Others were investors, and a few represented advisory roles. They were all present for the same reason, to decide the future of the company. But this time, the decision-making process was no longer balanced the way it used to be. The CEO was there as well. He looked the same as before, controlled, composed, confident, in a way that suggested experience rather than emotion. But there was something else now. A slight tension behind his calm expression, as if he was aware that control was no longer entirely in his hands. He hadn't recognized me at the conference, and I could tell that realization still hadn't fully reached him in this setting either. The meeting began in a structured way. Reports were presented, financial summaries were reviewed, and proposals were discussed. Everything followed a familiar pattern, but the tone was different. There was less certainty in the room, more evaluation, more caution. Every participant seemed aware that whatever decision was made here would reshape the company's direction completely. I remained silent for the first part of the discussion, listening carefully. This was not the moment to rush forward. I needed to understand how others were positioning themselves, what assumptions they were making, and where the resistance points were forming. Different groups presented their offers in subtle competition. Some pushed for aggressive acquisition, others suggested partial restructuring with external leadership. Each proposal carried its own risks, its own intentions. I observed how the room responded to each one. Some ideas were met with interest, others with hesitation. When it was my turn, I didn't immediately stand or make a dramatic gesture. I simply began speaking when the discussion naturally reached a pause. My voice was steady, not louder than necessary, not softer than required. I didn't try to dominate the room. I didn't need to. I explained our position clearly, not as outsiders trying to take control, but as participants who already understood the system from within. I spoke about stability, not disruption. About continuity, not replacement. About strengthening what already existed instead of dismantling it completely. As I spoke, I could feel the attention in the room shifting. Not dramatically, but gradually. People were no longer just hearing the words, they were evaluating them. Comparing them with other proposals. Measuring feasibility. Considering long-term consequences instead of short-term gains. The CEO listened without interruption. His expression remained controlled, but his focus was sharp. I could tell he was analyzing every sentence, not just for content, but for intent. This was no longer a casual conversation or a formal presentation. This was positioning. When I finished, there was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Then the discussion resumed, but the tone had changed. Questions were more precise. Comparisons became more direct. My proposal was no longer just one option among many. It had become a reference point in the room. The negotiations continued for hours. Points were debated, numbers were reviewed again, risks were weighed repeatedly. There were moments of disagreement, moments of reconsideration, and moments where silence itself became part of the decision-making process. At one point, I noticed something subtle. The resistance that had initially existed around our offer was weakening, not disappearing completely, but shifting. It was no longer being dismissed, it was being examined more seriously than before. That shift mattered more than any immediate approval. Because in environments like this, decisions are rarely made in a single moment. They evolve through perception, through repeated evaluation, through gradual acceptance. By the time the meeting began to conclude, it was clear that nothing final would be announced immediately. But something important had changed. The direction of consideration had shifted closer to our position than anyone outside the room would have expected at the beginning of the day. As people began to leave, conversations continued in smaller groups. Quiet discussions, private exchanges, brief acknowledgements. I didn't engage in all of them. I didn't need to. My role in that moment was not to convince further, but to let the presence of what had already been presented settle into their thinking. The CEO approached briefly before leaving. There was no confrontation, no direct acknowledgement of past interactions, no emotional tone. Just a professional exchange, measured and controlled. But in his eyes, I could see something new, recognition that was no longer based on assumption, but on awareness. Not of who I had been, but of what I had become in this process. As I stepped out of the room, the corridor outside felt quieter than usual. The weight of the meeting hadn't disappeared, but it had changed form. It was no longer uncertainty. It was transition. And I knew that what had just begun inside that room was no longer something that could be easily reversed or ignored, because the balance had already started to move in a direction that no one had fully accepted yet. But everyone had already begun to adjust to internally. Nothing changed overnight, and that was exactly the point. Power rarely announces itself in sudden explosions when it is real. Instead, it settles quietly, like something that has always belonged there but was simply unnoticed before. After the boardroom meeting, there were no public celebrations, no dramatic headlines confirming immediate victory. The company continued its operations, meetings continued, and employees still came to work as usual. On the surface, everything looked normal, but underneath that normality, the structure had already begun to shift. The first visible change came in decision-making. Proposals that once moved quickly through approval layers now paused longer than before, not because of confusion, but because the weight of influence had changed. My position, combined with the structured support of my partners, meant that certain decisions could no longer be finalized without consideration from our side. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not directly involved. But inside the system, it was very real. I didn't rush to assert control. That would have been unnecessary and counterproductive. Instead, I focused on observation. I attended meetings where required, reviewed internal reports, and studied how different departments functioned under pressure. The goal was not to disrupt, but to understand deeply enough that disruption would never be needed. At the same time, I continued running my own company without interruption. That balance was essential. One side represented what I was building independently. The other represented what I was influencing from within. Both required attention, and both were connected in ways that only became clearer over time. Inside the acquired company, reactions varied. Some executives were cautious, trying to understand what the shift meant for their roles. Others were quietly resistant, unsure of how the new influence would affect their authority. But there was also a group that adapted quickly, recognizing that change was already happening and positioning themselves accordingly. I did not engage with emotion-driven responses. My approach was consistent, clarity, structure, and long-term stability. Where others saw uncertainty, I saw patterns. Where others reacted impulsively, I took time to evaluate. That difference slowly began to influence the tone of discussions. One of the first internal changes we implemented focused on inefficiencies that had existed long before the financial decline. Not dramatic restructuring, but targeted improvements, streamlining communication channels, simplifying approval processes, and removing redundant steps that slowed execution. These changes were not framed as takeover decisions. They were presented as necessary adjustments for stability. The response was mixed at first, but results speak louder than assumptions. Within a short period, certain operations became noticeably more efficient. Delays decreased. Coordination improved. Even those who were initially skeptical began acknowledging that the system was functioning better than before. This gradual improvement shifted perception further. People inside the organization began to associate our presence not with disruption, but with correction. Not with loss of control, but with restoration of balance. That perception was important, because it reduced resistance without forcing it. At the same time, I maintained distance from unnecessary visibility. I didn't position myself as a public figure within the company. I didn't seek attention in internal communications or external representation. My role was not to dominate space but to guide direction. There were moments when I thought back to the earlier stages, the rejection, the dismissal, the assumption that I was too small to matter. Those memories no longer carried the same emotional weight, but they remained relevant. They reminded me how perception can be limited by timing. What people see at one moment is never the full picture of what is becoming. Outside the company, market observers began noticing subtle changes. Analysts commented on improved stability. Investors responded to clearer strategic direction. The uncertainty that had once surrounded the company started to fade slowly, replaced by cautious confidence. None of this happened because of a single action. It was the result of accumulated decisions, careful positioning, and consistent execution. Inside meetings, my contributions became more central. Not because I demanded attention, but because the logic behind my input consistently aligned with outcomes. Over time, this created a shift in how others responded. Suggestions were no longer just heard, they were considered more seriously from the beginning. The CEO, still formally in position, interacted with increasing awareness of the new structure. Our conversations remained professional, but there was a clear recognition that the balance of influence had changed. He did not resist openly, nor did he concede verbally. Instead, he adapted, as experienced leaders often do when circumstances evolve beyond initial expectations. There was no confrontation, no conflict, just adjustment. And adjustment in systems like this is often more powerful than resistance. As weeks passed, internal confidence improved further. Projects that had previously stalled were restarted. Strategic plans that had been delayed were revised and executed. The company was no longer just stabilizing. It was beginning to move forward again, but in a direction shaped by new input and revised priorities. Through all of this, I remained focused on consistency. No unnecessary expansion of authority. No sudden declarations. Just steady influence applied where it mattered most. Because true control is not about visibility or dominance. It is about alignment. When systems begin to function in a way that reflects your understanding without needing constant enforcement, that is when influence becomes real. And as everything continued to settle into this new structure, it became increasingly clear that what had started as a quiet position had evolved into something far more permanent than anyone had initially expected. The visit came without announcement. No formal request, no scheduled meeting, no corporate email exchange. It was a simple message delivered through a secretary asking for a short meeting at my office. The name attached to it was familiar, but the tone was different from anything I had seen before. There was no authority in the request, no dominance, just a quiet formality that suggested acceptance of circumstance rather than control over it. I agreed. When the door opened that afternoon, he stepped in alone. The same man who once sat at the center of a polished boardroom surrounded by decision-makers, now stood in a much simpler space. My office was not designed to impress. It was clean, organized, and functional. Nothing about it tried to display power. And yet, in that moment, it held all of it. He looked around briefly before meeting my eyes. There was no arrogance in his expression now, no expectation that he would lead the conversation. Just awareness, the kind that forms after a long process of realization. I gestured for him to sit. He did. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, just a necessary one. The kind that exists when both people understand that the past cannot be undone, only acknowledged. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than I remembered. Not weak, but careful. "I should have recognized you earlier," he said. There was no attempt to justify it. No excuses. Just a statement. I didn't respond immediately. I allowed the words to exist in the space between us without rushing to fill it, because in moments like this, responses often mattered less than understanding. He continued, explaining how the situation had changed, how the company had gone through its restructuring, how decisions that once seemed certain now felt different in hindsight. He didn't frame himself as a victim of circumstance. He spoke like someone who had observed his own path too late to change its direction. I listened. Not as someone seeking validation, but as someone who already understood the outcome of everything being said. Eventually, he stopped speaking, and then there was silence again. This time, it felt different. Not uncertain, but final in a quiet way. I leaned slightly forward, not to assert dominance, but to clarify something that didn't need further confusion. "I was never small," I said calmly. "I just wasn't seen." He nodded slowly. There was no disagreement in his expression, only acceptance. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't about proving superiority. It was never about that. It was about perception, timing, and the limitations of judgment made too early. People often confuse absence of visibility with absence of value. That misunderstanding had defined the beginning of everything that led us here. He looked down briefly, then back up. "I underestimated you," he said. This time, there was no follow-up, no explanation attached to it, just acknowledgement. And that was enough. Because acknowledgement, when it is honest, carries more weight than any defense or apology. We discussed a few remaining formalities regarding the transition. Nothing emotional, nothing personal. Just the final structural elements that needed clarity. The conversation was efficient, stripped of unnecessary complexity. The kind of conversation that happens when the outcome is already decided and only alignment remains. At one point, he asked about the direction of the company moving forward. It wasn't a challenge. It was curiosity mixed with responsibility for what he had once led. I explained it simply. Stability first. Long-term structure second. Growth built on systems rather than assumptions. He listened carefully, not interrupting once. When everything was covered, there was no need for continuation. No hidden tension remained. No unresolved conflict lingered in the space between us. What had once been a moment of rejection had transformed completely, not through confrontation, but through time and accumulation of change. He stood up first. Before leaving, he paused briefly. "I hope you know," he said. "This wasn't something I could see at the time. I understood what he meant. And I also understood what he didn't say. That visibility is always limited by position. That decisions are shaped by incomplete information. That people often judge based on what is immediately measurable rather than what is quietly developing." I didn't respond with resentment. There was no need for it anymore. Instead, I gave a small nod. Not as forgiveness, not as acceptance, but as recognition of reality. He left the room quietly, closing the door behind him. I stayed seated for a moment, not thinking about victory or revenge or closure. Those concepts felt too small for what had actually happened. This was not a story of proving someone wrong. It was a story of evolution that simply outpaced perception. What once felt like rejection had become a reference point in a much larger structure of change. And as I looked around the office that now reflected years of unseen work, one thing remained clear: the moment I had once walked out of that boardroom had not ended anything at all. It had only started a chain of decisions that had already reached their final form. And in the end, it was never about being seen as small or big. It was about timing, patience, and the silent power of building when no one is watching. What began as rejection turned into direction, and what looked like an ending became the foundation of everything that followed.